ACR Convergence is right around the corner. Join us in sunny San Diego to connect with rheumatology influencers like Rheumcat, at Houseman MD, and at Bharat Kumar MD. Catch John Houseman and Joe Rojas daily at 4 p.m., where they will be making room for you, our listeners, to share your convergence experiences on the Daily Roundup, a limited edition podcast episode from ACR Convergence.
Welcome to ACR On Air, the official podcast of the American College of Rheumatology, where we have engaging conversations with leading rheumatology professionals on topics such as the latest research on rheumatic diseases, solutions for addressing practice management issues, legislative policies impacting patient care, and more. Here's your host.
Hello, and welcome to ACR Journals on Air podcast. I am your host, Vicky Shamagam. Osteoarthritis is the most common form of arthritis, and we know that post-traumatic arthritis is particularly common following knee injury. However, until now, there have been no uniformly accepted criteria to define osteoarthritis on MRI imaging. Today, we're going to discuss two osteoarthritis imaging studies. The first is development of a magnetic resonance imaging-based definition of knee osteoarthritis, data from the multi-center osteoarthritis study, which was recently published in Arthritis and Rheumatology. The second paper is diagnostic accuracy of candidate MRI knee osteoarthritis definitions versus radiograph in an anterior cruciate ligament injury cohort, and that manuscript was published in Arthritis Care and Research. A link to both the manuscripts and disclosures are in our show notes from today. And I'm delighted to be joined for this twofer episode by the first author of both manuscripts, Dr. Jean Liu. Dr. Liu graduated from the University of Texas at Austin with degrees in biology and English, and went on to earn her medical degree at the University of Texas Medical Branch in Galveston, Texas. She completed her internal medicine residency at Oregon Health Science University in Portland, Oregon, and her rheumatology fellowship at the University of Washington in Seattle, Washington. As a fellow, she won an ACR Distinguished Fellow Award in 2019, and she was a member of the winning team of the ACR Knowledge Bowl in 2018 and 2019. While Dr. Liu is by day an assistant professor of medicine at the section of rheumatology at Boston University, out of hours, she is better known as the social media influencer Rheumcat, and her notable credits include initiating the 2020 ACR Donut Bake-Off Challenge during the online Convergence meeting, as well as being a prolific poster of sweet treats and good reads on social media. Welcome to the show, Rheumcat.
Thanks for having me. I'm a huge fan.
So much as I want to spend the whole show talking to you about books and baked goods, Jean, we do have to cover the science first. And I'm going to start with your first article, the development of an MRI-based definition of knee osteoarthritis. Give us some background on why this study was done. I believe there'd been a previous Delphi study that's looked at MRI-based definitions of osteoarthritis. Why was another study needed?
Okay, so the background for using MRI to define OA is because we use X-ray to define OA for studies, but X-ray is not sensitive to early changes. And MRI can demonstrate abnormalities in the joint sooner than X-ray can, although MRI can also show abnormalities in joints that don't have OA. We don't have a consensus MRI definition of OA based on MRI yet. And we do need one because we can use this in observational studies to identify potentially modifiable risk factors that could serve as interventions in trials. And then we could also use an MRI-based definition of OA for use in clinical trials as well. There was a previously developed Delphi panel-based definition, but it hasn't been widely validated, nor is it really in use right now in research. It's also got a more complex definition, and we were wanting to see if an alternative candidate definition that was a bit simpler and easier to apply could perform as well as that prior definition. So all of that set the stage for why we wanted to study candidate MRI definitions for OA.
That makes sense. So for this study, you used data from a sizable NIH-funded cohort called the MOST study, which stands for the Multi-Center Osteoarthritis Study. Tell us about this cohort. Who is enrolled? What are their demographics? And what data is collected on these patients?
Yeah, so MOST is an NIH-funded longitudinal cohort that's been going on for over 20 years. It's enrolled adults who are middle-aged and older with or at risk of OA in the original cohort, and now we are also enrolling a younger, more diverse population. So my institution, BU, is one of the main sites, analytic sites involved. The patients are actually enrolled through the Alabama and Iowa sites. So these participants undergo extensive data collection from demographics, questionnaires that include pain and function, imaging, including X-ray and MRI, and more recently CT, as well as a battery of physical performance measures, pain measures, and much more. So just very rich data collection in a large cohort that spanned a lot of years now.
Great. And patients enrolled in MOST undergo baseline and then serial radiographs and MRIs, and you use these images to test various candidate definitions for osteoarthritis, obviously selecting out a cohort of knees that were being examined. So tell us, how did you select the cohort of knees that you included in your analysis? And can you tell us a bit more about what you did in this study?
So we used a pretty simple study inclusion. So we looked at the 60-month study visit. In MOST, it's one of the earlier visits. And we included all the knees that had available X-ray and MRI measures. And in this study, we did a prevalent OA cross-sectional analysis. So we wanted to study our candidate MRI definitions of OA, as well as the Delphi panel-based definition against two reference standards. So these are not gold standards, but reference standards for validation, one of which is radiographic OA, which is defined as Kellgren-Lawrence grade 2 or higher on X-ray. And the other one was not radiograph-based. It was a survey-based symptomatic OA definition that's been previously validated. In terms of how did we come up with these candidate definitions of OA that are based on MRI? So we had this prevailing idea that this candidate MRI definition of OA should not only have cartilage damage, which can also occur after joint trauma in young athletes in the absence of actual OA, as well as the other criterion that any candidate MRI definition of OA should include osteophytes because they represent a bony response to cartilage loss. Using different cutoff thresholds for these two criteria, as well as the optional inclusion of the presence of bone marrow lesions or synovitis, we came up with 10 potential candidate definitions that we tested, and we tested their performance against the reference standards, meaning we looked at sensitivity, specificity, positive and negative predictive value, and the area under the curve, or the AUC. And that is how we determined how they performed.
And I've got to confess, there was a part of your manuscript that made me do a double take as I was reading it, because there's also an MRI scoring system you used called the WORMS system. Can you tell us what that is and how did you use it?
So there are a lot of acronyms for the scoring systems for imaging in OA, but simply WORMS is a semi-quantitative MRI scoring system for the abnormalities that you can see in the joint, like the cartilage damage, osteophytes, bone marrow lesions, and synovitis that I mentioned that are part of our candidate definitions. So if you take cartilage damage as an example, so there's 14 subregions in the knee joint, and each of these subregions is scored 0 to 6, depending on how much cartilage damage there is. So in our study, we used a cutoff of 2 or higher out of the 6. So 2 would correspond to there's a partial thickness cartilage loss, so not all the way through, but partially lost, and there are focal defects, meaning it's not the entire area, but it's kind of more spotty.
Mm-hmm. And so walk us through your data. What did you find?
Yeah, so this is a pretty numbers heavy kind of paper, and to just put it simply, we ended up with 3 best definitions, one of which was the original Delphi panel based definition. and the other two were our candidate definitions. So we had one that we ended up calling most simple, and this is just 2 factors. So a cartilage score of 2 or higher, using that worm scoring I just mentioned, and an osteophyte score of 2 or higher. So this is not a ton of cartilage loss. It's not a particularly large osteophyte. These are still pretty subtle changes that you can see on MRI. But this was a definition that had a sensitivity of around 95 to 96%, and an AUC around 65 to 69%. And with similar performance, our other candidate definition that we later termed most optional was the cartilage of 2 or higher, osteophyte 2 or higher, and you could either have bone marrow lesion or synovitis, and those had thresholds of 1 or higher. And this is again based on the worm scoring.
And so what does this mean for osteoarthritis, and particularly for osteoarthritis research moving forward?
So this provides us with other possible MRI-based definitions of OA that can be used in research and clinical trials, including a much simpler definition than the Delphi panel-based one, which has a lot of factors that are involved. So we do need to validate these definitions in other cohorts that are not in the one that we developed them in, but it's potentially an easier way to use MRI to define OA for research.
And I'm assuming part of the benefit of that is that you'll be better able to enroll in OA research studies.
Yes. So partially, yes, in clinical trials or observational studies where we're looking at natural history and looking at risk factors. That's correct.
Excellent. So let's move on to your second study, which is the diagnostic accuracy of candidate MRI knee osteoarthritis definitions versus radiographic in an acute anterior cruciate ligament injury cohort. This kind of builds on the prior study we were just talking about, but it applies the analysis to younger people with ACL injury. So in this analysis, you use data from a different established cohort called the Canon study. And I'm going to confess, I have a conflict of interest here because Canon is actually my husband's name. So I'm super tickled to talk about a clinical trial that shares his name. I should mention the Canon study is not new. Not that I want to say the data is old, because that would upset him, but it was a seminal study on treatment for acute ACL injuries completed in Sweden and published in the New England Journal of Medicine back in 2010. How did you use the data from the Canon study to investigate MRI definitions of osteoarthritis?
So through our Swedish collaborators, we had the opportunity to use these data to do a validation of our best performing MRI-based definitions of OA. So this is a validation study in a very different cohort from most, because most is of older adults, mean age is about 66, and they had established prevalent OA, whereas in this study, we're looking at younger adults who had ACL injury, and the OA that we're identifying would be post-traumatic OA.
Yeah, so in your OA definitions, you test what you described as the best MRI OA definitions defined in the most study data. And then you also test that original Delphi panel definition, but you're doing it in this younger cohort. And I think there was some conversion you had to do for the worm scoring method you'd used in most, and a different analysis method for the Canon data. Can you explain that to us?
Yeah, I don't want to go into too much detail. It was almost a 1-to-1 conversion. So this is the anterior cruciate ligament OA score, different acronym, but similar concept. It's semi-quantitative MRI scoring system. It's developed by a lot of the same people, the greats in OA imaging, but it's just this one is developed specifically for looking at people post ACL injury. But the conversion was pretty simple, and we didn't have to do a lot of mental gymnastics for it.
So talk us through how you did your evaluation. So there were these 3 definitions, the most simple, the most optimal that you've described earlier, and the Delphi-based definition that you also compared to the radiographic OA definition, the 5-year follow-up in this Canon cohort. How did you set up that analysis?
So we tried to do it as similarly to what we did in most as possible. So same performance metrics, sensitivity, specificity, PPV, NPV, and AUC. We had to use radiographic OA as the only reference standard because in this cohort, we were not able to use the survey-based definition of symptomatic OA. So that was a limitation that we addressed. And this time, instead of looking at 10 candidate MRI based definitions of OA, we just had the three best performing ones from the previous study. So again, most simple was cartilage score of 2 or higher and osteophyte score of 2 or higher on the MRI imaging. And the most optional was those two features and either bone marrow lesion or synovitis. So we just looked at these three and again calculated our performance metrics.
And if you wouldn't mind for our listeners, could you expand a little bit on the demographics of the Canon study participants? Because obviously they differed quite significantly from those in the MOST study and actually from most other osteoarthritis studies, right? Just fill our listeners in on that.
Yeah, this is an acute injury cohort. So these are people who are presenting pretty shortly after ACL injury. So people who are going to have ACL injury are going to be much younger than a typical OA cohort. So the mean age here was 26 and it was majority male. So we only had 26% female, whereas in MOST, we had older people, but it was 62% female. So quite different.
Yeah. And some of your results were a little unexpected. So tell us what you found.
So our performance of the three MRI definitions of OA were very similar to one another, but when you compare it to what we saw in the MOST cohort, we got much lower sensitivity, so 50% or lower. So our MRI-based definitions of OA were just not very sensitive in this ACL injury cohort. We did see higher specificities, though, of these MRI-based definitions. So in the paper, we have a very extensive discussion about why this might be. We talk at length about the differences in the imaging views that are available, as well as the different ways in which knees were scored and radiographic OA was defined in this cohort versus in MOST. It gets quite technical, and I thank our collaborators, especially Frank Romer, for helping us walk through why this might be from an imaging perspective. And then, of course, there's a completely different population, this younger post-ACL injury PTOA population. So these are all factors that could have explained why we saw what we did.
Yeah. And I guess I know you see patients, plenty of patients clinically. What do you think this means for rheumatologists evaluating younger patients with post-traumatic OA? First part of that question. And then second part of the question, how do you think this is going to impact clinical trial design for sort of younger patients with OA?
So this is not ready for use in like the clinic. So I would not use these definitions for diagnosing someone in clinic. And besides, like these scoring systems are used in research, and I haven't seen anyone actually use them in a radiology report.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of clinical trials for preventing PTOA, because our performance metrics in this cohort at least were much lower than expected, I think there might be a bit more work to do before we can actually use these MRI definitions for a clinical trial outcome in prevention of PTOA. So more validation work is needed, and we're actually working on some other studies looking at early stage symptomatic knee OA, and can we use MRI based definitions to define that? It's part of a portfolio of a lot more work that I'm doing.
Excellent. I can't wait to hear about it in the years to come. So, Jean, I appreciate all the work that went into that data and how complex that analysis was. And thank you for agreeing to talk about 2 papers in one episode. I wanted to ask you now a couple questions about your career. Your journey has taken you all over the country. I don't know if you were trying to hit all the different states or if this was just chance, but would you mind sharing with our listeners how you got your start in rheumatology and what your experience was as you moved through training and fellowship and then finally settled on your first attending position?
Yeah, so I first heard about rheumatology in 2009. I was pre-med and applying for a medical school, and a friend with ankylosing spondylitis told me that rheumatology was probably a good fit for my personality, and they were right. Pretty early on in medical school, I I got in contact with a rheumatologist who was just a really great clinician and teacher. And like through shadowing him, and I just it became enamored with the subspecialty, and I knew as soon as I did my third year rotation in rheumatology as a medical student that this is a correct field for me. So I went into residency at OHSU in Oregon and knew I was room cat by then. And I did my first clinical research study in residency, and it was a really simple chart review based study. I mean, it was not simple for me because I had to do the chart review and extract the data, but it's a simple design. And that's when I knew I wanted to do clinical research, and I knew that I needed to do some formal training in that. So when I matched to a fellowship at UW in Seattle, I knew I had to get on the T32, do a third year, earn a master's in epidemiology, do research, and do all of that. So that's sort of how I did my training. Every step, there was a mentor that was helpful to me, and they showed me the way forward in how I could achieve what I wanted to do. And then I came here to BU in July 2020 because it was just a great opportunity to be mentored by someone who is a great researcher, clinical researcher, and has a great track record of mentoring a lot of people. And this is also a place with a lot of infrastructure for doing a lot of clinical epidemiology research. So it was the perfect fit.
Perfect. And you've mentioned several mentors, but haven't told us much about them. They obviously impacted your career. Would you mind sharing who they were and how those interactions kind of changed your pathway?
Yeah, and they're all almost serendipitous interactions. So Jennifer Barton at OHSU was my first rheumatology research mentor. So she mentored me through that first research project, and we met in the VA workroom in my intern year. When I was on my first rotation with rheumatology, I introduced myself and I said I'm an intern. I want to do rheumatology, and she like cheered. She was happy. She was happy. She's happy to do that. And I thought, this is a great person. I didn't even know what research she did, but I said I want to contact her and see how I can go forward with this. So she opened a lot of doors. And then the second person who was really instrumental is Leanne Gensler. She's at UCSF. And I met her in the poster hall at ACR in the last time that I was in San Diego. So that was 2017. And I just walked up to her, told her I really liked her work and that I was really interested in cardiovascular disease and axial spondyloarthritis. And that led to a mentorship relationship that has lasted till now. Opened a lot of doors there. She encouraged me to apply for some small grants, which I got. And I was able to use data from her cohort to do my master's thesis and to publish several papers. So that was another step forward. And then Tahina Nyoji at BU, who's my current mentor, I knew her as a gout goddess when reading her gout work as a resident when the ACP guidelines came out in 2017. And they were just really conflicting with rheumatology guidelines. And I was like, here's this gout goddess writing about why she strongly believes in evidence-based medicine and why ACP is not seeing the evidence-based medicine. And I thought this person is amazing. So kind of just you just have to like recognize that sometimes you can just go up to the people who are your role models, who are doing the things that you want to do, and you can strike up a conversation, and they could end up being really fruitful mentoring relationships.
Oh, that's really good advice. And I love that you met mentors in the poster hall. That's super cool and exciting. And I'm thrilled to hear that story. So you're now on a physician scientist track. You see patients in the clinic, you cover the inpatient service, and you're building your research portfolio. What tips do you have for fellows who might be wanting to follow a similar career pathway?
Well, first you have to think about what kind of research do you want to do and how deep into that research do you want to get. So if you think you want to do it 50% or more, if you want to pursue grant funding, the real way that you would tackle that is you need the formal training and you need to do more than the 2 years of rheumatology fellowship, because the 2 years of rheumatology fellowship are not enough to get that research training and to get that research, get that start in research. So if you are applying for rheumatology fellowship, maybe for next year's fellows, you would be looking for T32 training or other sources of support to support you in a third year or probably even a fourth year, as well as formal training if you do not already have formal training, which I did not. And then you have to think about things like how much protected time would you be okay with, would you want for your research, and gain an understanding of what that protected time means. So for me, I have 75% protected time through grants, my own as well as my mentors. And that means that I have 2 half-day clinics a week. And in the whole academic year, 4 weeks total of inpatient coverage. And I do some teaching. But otherwise, I do research, which means various things on various days. It could mean doing a meeting like this one, actually writing papers or writing grants, or just doing all sorts of other things that involve being in my office and thinking really hard. And then the other thing that you have to understand is the amount of rejection that you face while you're doing good and important work. And you have to have the belief that you will get there if you keep going, because you just believe that you're going to do good things for other people if you kept going. So it's a lot of soul searching that has to happen as well, I think.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice and something that often is underestimated, I think, in the life of a physician scientist is being able to kind of find your self-worth within yourself, because the rejections are frequent and it's kind of part of the scientific process. So I cannot let you leave our podcast without covering 2 important other topics. Firstly, you're an avid reader, and I'm always interested in hearing what you're reading. So can you share with us some books that have inspired you during your career?
I don't know about inspiration. I just like reading things that have vivid prose and good characterization. So something that you can get lost in. I'm a really quick reader just because I'm a bibliophile and autodidact. I just read a lot as a child because it's free. As long as you have access to a library, you can teach yourself anything you want. Recently, things I've liked. So Anthony Doerr, who wrote All the Light We Cannot See, as well as Cloud Cuckoo Land. He's got a certain style in those 2 novels that might take a bit getting used to, but he does parallel stories and different points in time, like chronological time. He does that really well. So like him, I recently finished The Covenant of Water, and that's about 700 pages. It's a generational story that spans about 77 years in the 20th century. Really just beautiful and just kind of tragic as well. So I like that. And a fun, quicker read was Lessons in Chemistry, which was a book I got for my birthday.
Oh yeah, super fun book actually, and I've read a couple of those, and I'm halfway through Covenant of Water, so it's a tome. So I'm sure people will thank you for those recommendations. And then finally, you were instrumental in organizing the online, I guess it's called the ACR Donut Bake-Off Challenge, that took place during that crazy 2020 ACR convergence meeting. People will remember that was the first COVID year. We were supposed to converge at the Washington, D.C. Convention Center, but unfortunately the venue had been converted into a COVID field hospital. So instead, we converged together apart. What prompted you during that time to set up the ACR Bake Off, and what tips do you have for fellow rheumatology introverts wanting to connect around the world?
So you must have recalled that I kept asking you for a donut wall the year before that. So ACR 2019, I was just like, I think cardiology or some other conference had a donut wall. It's basically a wooden board with like little like sticks that you stick donuts through that people have at their weddings or something. So I just said like we should have a donut wall. So we did have donut walls that year, and then the next year, because we were virtual, I said we can't tweet about this physical thing that we're looking for in the convention center, so we should just eat our own donuts. We should just bake our own donuts or eat donuts or whatever. And I love baking for other people, so I thought that was a good way to connect. And it was fun because people like made ACR shaped donuts and things like that. And the following year, I think we were just eating pastries at ULAR. We were at ULAR, like not this past year, the year before. I had a pastry challenge because we were in Copenhagen and they have amazing pastries. So we were just eating all sorts of pastries. And this year, we're doing bracelets, like Taylor Swift concert bracelets, like friendship bracelets. So I think my tip for introverts is that, well, I mean, for this introvert at least, it's easier for me to like put myself out there online than in person. And it's just easier to talk to people after you get to know them online. So put yourself out there online, make a bracelet, eat a donut, whatever. And then when you meet people in real life, it just becomes easier to sort of just pick up the conversation. And whereas it's been hard for me to just walk up to a complete stranger to network when it's someone that I've been talking to online and like doing all of these challenges with, it's just easier to just like meet them and have dinner. And then we can talk about what we've been, tweeting about or posting about. So
yeah. And now you're famous. I feel like everyone wants to meet Roomcat and get a sticker.
Everyone does want to meet Roomcat. I made 100 stickers. I've almost made my goal of 80 bracelets. I'm not going to make any more bracelets. Whatever I make and take to San Diego, that's it. I am going to be at specific sessions because I have to be there because I'm moderating or speaking. I'll have my bracelets, I'll have my stickers, and once I run out, I'm sorry. So if you're able to make these sessions, please come and please pick up a bracelet and or a sticker. You can have both.
Excellent. And I really appreciate this terrific discussion. I've enjoyed hearing about your work and your, I'll put quote unquote, social life. I know we're going to be hearing more about your research in the future.
Thank you.
So today, my thanks go to Kanans. Kanan is the Japanese goddess of mercy, female, the name of a Tamil god, male, a seminal ACL treatment and now osteoarthritis study, and of course my husband, the real Kanan Shamagam. Thank you all for listening to this podcast. ACR Journals on Air is a production of the American College of Rheumatology. Please follow at AC Room on social media, email us at podcast@rheumatology.org, and rate and subscribe to our podcast at acrjournalsonair.org or wherever you get your podcasts.